The tapestry of fate is often woven with threads of both gold and ash, and for one ill-starred emperor, the threads were irrevocably stained crimson from the moment he drew his first breath. His arrival wasn't greeted with joyous hymns or the sweet scent of incense, but with a chorus of dread, a symphony of shadows whispering a prophecy so abhorrent, so utterly monstrous, that it threatened to unravel the very fabric of the kingdom. We're talking about a prophecy that painted him not as a benevolent ruler, but as a devourer, a monster cloaked in royal robes, destined to consume his own flesh and blood. Picture the scene, the opulent birthing chamber, draped in the finest silks, usually a beacon of hope and new beginnings, now heavy with an almost palpable sense of foreboding. Midwives scurried about, their faces etched with a mixture of anticipation and terror. The queen, beautiful even in the throes of labor, cried out, her pain a counterpoint to the hushed whispers that snaked through the corridors of the palace. This was no ordinary birth. This was the arrival of a force that would either elevate the kingdom to unimaginable heights or drag it down into the deepest, darkest abyss. And then he was born, a healthy, robust babe, seemingly perfect in every way. But as the cries of the newborn filled the room, a chilling gust of wind swept through the palace, extinguishing the torches and plunging the chamber into momentary darkness. It was a fleeting moment, a trick of the light, some would say. But others knew, deep in their bones, that it was an omen, a sign of the horrors to come, immediately following the birth. The royal astrologers, cloistered in their chambers high above the palace, pored over their charts, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight. They were the keepers of cosmic knowledge, the interpreters of the stars, and they had been tasked with divining the newborn prince's destiny. What they discovered sent shockwaves of fear through their ranks, a chilling revelation that threatened to shatter the foundations of the kingdom. Their findings were delivered to the king in hushed tones, the message shrouded in euphemisms and veiled warnings, but the core truth remained terrifyingly clear. The prince was destined to become a cannibal, to devour his own children in a desperate attempt to cling to power. Can you imagine the sheer horror that gripped the king's heart? To learn that his heir, his own flesh and blood, was fated to commit such an unspeakable act? The weight of the prophecy must have felt like a physical burden, crushing him beneath its unimaginable weight. This wasn't just a threat to his lineage. It was a threat to the very soul of the kingdom. The prophecy didn't offer specifics, mind you. It didn't reveal when or how this monstrous act would occur. It simply stated, in chillingly vague terms, that the emperor would consume his children to survive. Survive what, you ask? That was the question that plagued the king and his advisors for years to come. Was it a threat to the throne, a famine, a plague, or something far more sinister? The ambiguity of the prophecy only served to amplify the fear and paranoia that festered within the palace walls. Every smile became suspect, every gesture analyzed, every whispered conversation scrutinized for signs of treachery. The king, once a just and benevolent ruler, became consumed by suspicion, his mind poisoned by the specter of his son's horrifying destiny. Think about the psychological toll this would take. The constant dread, the gnawing fear that any decision, any action, could inadvertently trigger the fulfillment of the prophecy. It's a level of stress that would break even the strongest of wills. And what about the young prince himself? He grew up in the shadow of this terrible prophecy, blissfully unaware of the darkness that clung to him like a shroud. He was loved and doted upon, but always with an undercurrent of fear and apprehension. Courtiers would smile at him, then quickly avert their gaze, whispering amongst themselves about the monster he was destined to become. His every action, every childish tantrum, every act of defiance was interpreted through the lens of the prophecy, fueling the paranoia that gripped the court. Was this seemingly innocent act a sign of the darkness within? Was this childish outburst a harbinger of the horrors to come? The prophecy became a self-fulfilling curse, shaping the prince's destiny in ways that were both subtle and profound. The constant suspicion, the veiled whispers, the ever-present fear, all of it contributed to the very darkness that they were so desperately trying to prevent. The astrologers, desperate to avert the impending doom, proposed countless solutions, each more bizarre and outlandish than the last. Some suggested sacrificing the prince to appease the gods, a solution the king immediately rejected. Others proposed exiling him to a remote island, far from the reach of power, a plan that seemed equally unpalatable. The king, torn between his love for his son and his duty to his kingdom, found himself trapped in an impossible situation. He couldn't kill his own child, but he couldn't ignore the prophecy either. He was a man caught between a rock and a very, very hard place. The birth of the emperor, therefore, wasn't a celebration of new life, but a grim warning, a chilling prelude to the horrors that were to unfold. It was the moment when the threads of fate were irrevocably twisted, setting the stage for a tragedy of epic proportions. And as the young prince grew, the shadow of the prophecy loomed ever larger, casting a pall of darkness over the entire kingdom. The countdown to the unspeakable had begun. From the moment he drew his first breath, this emperor was a prisoner of prophecy. A chilling prediction clung to his cradle, a shadow whispering of unimaginable horrors, that he would devour his own children to survive. Can you imagine the weight of that? To be born under a curse so grotesque, so fundamentally unnatural, it would twist even the purest heart into something dark and monstrous. His early years weren't filled with the carefree joy of childhood. Instead, every smile felt like a betrayal of the doom foretold, every innocent game a preparation for the monstrous acts he was destined to commit. His father, the king, a man hardened by years of war and political intrigue, saw not a son, but a ticking time bomb, a threat to his dynasty, a walking, talking disaster waiting to happen. Love was a rare and precious commodity in the royal court, and for our emperor, it was virtually non-existent. His mother, a woman renowned for her beauty, but equally famed for her ambition, viewed him as a pawn, a means to solidify her power, a vessel to carry on the royal bloodline, regardless of the darkness that supposedly tainted it. She smothered him, not with affection, but with expectations. Expectations to be strong, to be ruthless, to be everything. His father wanted and more, but beneath the surface of forced smiles and courtly graces, a deep-seated fear festered. Fear of his own fate, fear of disappointing his parents, and perhaps most terrifyingly, fear of himself. The prophecy became an obsession, a constant hum in the back of his mind, shaping his thoughts, dictating his actions, and slowly, relentlessly, eroding his sanity. And then came the betrayals. Oh, the betrayals! The court was a viper's nest of ambition and deceit. Every smile hid a dagger, every whispered word a potential plot. He learned early on that trust was a weakness, that loyalty was a commodity to be bought and sold, and that even those closest to him would happily sacrifice him for their own gain. His childhood tutor, a man he had considered a friend and confidant, was discovered to be a spy, feeding information to a rival kingdom. His uncle, a charismatic and powerful figure in the court, openly plotted to usurp the throne, painting the young emperor as unstable and unfit to rule. And even his own advisors, men who swore oaths of loyalty, were caught skimming from the royal coffers, lining their own pockets at the expense of the realm. These weren't mere political squabbles. They were deeply personal wounds. Each betrayal chipped away at his trust, reinforcing the belief that he was surrounded by enemies, that no one was truly on his side. The weight of the crown, already heavy with the prophecy, became unbearable. He felt isolated, suffocated by the expectations and the constant threat of betrayal. Sleep offered no respite. Nightmares plagued him, vivid and horrifying visions of the prophecy coming to pass. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, the taste of bile in his throat. The line between reality and fantasy began to blur. He started seeing threats where none existed, interpreting innocent gestures as acts of aggression, and hearing whispers of treason in every conversation. His paranoia became a self-fulfilling prophecy. As he withdrew from the court, distrusting everyone around him, his advisors, feeling abandoned and ignored, began to plot against him. As he cracked down on perceived threats, imprisoning and executing those he suspected of disloyalty, his subjects grew resentful and fearful. The very measures he took to protect himself only served to isolate him further, driving him deeper into the abyss of madness. The burden of kingship, amplified by the terrifying prophecy and the constant betrayals, had warped his mind, twisting him into the very monster he feared becoming. He was no longer a king, but a prisoner of his own fear, a puppet dancing to the tune of a chilling prophecy. And soon, very soon, that prophecy would demand its due in the most horrific way imaginable. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the countdown to unimaginable horror had begun. You might think you understand pressure, stress, the weight of responsibility. But unless you've walked a mile in this emperor's shoes, you can't even begin to fathom the relentless torment that drove him to the edge. It was a perfect storm of fate, fear, and betrayal, a deadly cocktail that would transform a young ruler into a monster capable of the unspeakable. The whispers started subtly, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. At first, he dismissed them as the idle chatter of a court with too much time on its hands. But the emperor, a man whose every waking moment was steeped in the heavy broth of responsibility, couldn't afford to ignore anything, not when his very throne, his very life, hung precariously on the whims of fickle nobles and ambitious generals. He'd seen empires crumble from within, devoured by the insidious rot of betrayal, and he wouldn't let it happen to his dot. It began with glances. A furtive look exchanged between two courtiers as he passed. A hushed conversation that ceased abruptly as he approached. These weren't the respectful silences of deference, but the stifled whispers of conspiracy. He felt it in the air, a palpable tension that tightened with each passing day. His paranoia, once a manageable beast, began to grow, feeding on these perceived slights and fueling his suspicion. He started to see enemies everywhere. In the sycophantic smiles of his advisors, he saw veiled contempt. In the eager obedience of his generals, he detected hidden ambition. The loyal servants who had attended him for years, their faces now seemed etched with secret knowledge, their eyes holding a glint of something he couldn't quite decipher. His own family wasn't spared from his growing distrust. His brothers, each with their own claim to the throne, became objects of intense scrutiny. Every gesture, every word, was analyzed for signs of disloyalty. He saw plots lurking in their shared smiles at family dinners, and poison in the affectionate greetings they offered in public. He remembered how casually they had talked about the burdens of leadership, and how easy it would be to let someone else carry the weight of the crown. His most trusted advisor, Lord Elmsworth, a man who had served his father and now served him with unwavering loyalty, became a particular object of suspicion. Elmsworth was too calm, too wise, too indispensable. The emperor couldn't shake the feeling that Elmsworth knew more than he let on, that he was a puppeteer pulling strings from the shadows, orchestrating events to suit his own hidden agenda. He imagined Elmsworth, late at night, poring over ancient texts, searching for loopholes in the law, ways to usurp the throne without bloodshed. He had begun placing spies in Elmsworth's household, petty servants he had bribed to report any unusual activity. The reports came back clean, of course. Elmsworth was a master of his craft, the emperor told himself. He would be careful. Even his own wife, the empress, wasn't immune to his suspicion. He loved her, or at least, he thought he did. But even love couldn't extinguish the flame of paranoia that burned within him. He wondered if her gentle nature was a carefully constructed facade, a mask to hide her true intentions. Was she secretly plotting with his enemies, using her influence to undermine his reign? Every night, as they lay in bed, the emperor would stare at his wife, searching for any sign of deception in her sleeping face. And then there were his children, his beloved children. This was where the paranoia truly took root, poisoning his mind with the most horrific possibilities. The prophecy, it haunted him. It whispered in his dreams, a constant reminder of the doom that awaited him. The prophecy said that he would consume his own children to survive. Was this the treason then? Were his children not loyal subjects, but instruments of fate, destined to bring about his downfall? Did they carry the seed of his destruction within them, waiting to sprout and strangle him? He started to see a subtle defiance in their eyes, a rebellious spark that mirrored his own defiance of the prophecy. Each giggle, each playful embrace, felt like a calculated move in a deadly game. Was their innocence a weapon, a way to disarm him before they struck? The emperor would spend hours watching his children play, his heart aching with love and fear. He wanted to protect them, but the prophecy whispered in his ear, warning him that they were the greatest threat of all. The prophecy was a disease, a cancer in his mind, eating away at his reason, his sanity, his humanity. Sleep offered no respite. His dreams were filled with grotesque images of betrayal and violence. He saw his family gathered around a table, feasting on his entrails while mocking his helplessness. He dreamt of daggers hidden in the hands of his children, their innocent faces contorted with malice. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, unable to distinguish between reality and nightmare. The line blurred further each night, and the emperor grew ever more convinced that the treason he sensed was not just a figment of his imagination, but a real and present danger. It was everywhere, swirling around him, threatening to consume him whole. He had to act, and he had to act swiftly, before it was too late. He had to protect himself, even if it meant sacrificing everything he held dear. The air hung thick with dread. You could taste it, a metallic tang clinging to the back of your throat, a constant reminder of the precipice on which the emperor teetered. Not a precipice of defeat, mind you, but one far more horrifying, the chasm of utter madness. He was a king consumed, devoured not by enemies at the gate, but by the insidious creeping tendrils of paranoia that choked the very life out of his soul. Every shadow held a dagger, every whispered word a conspiracy, every smiling face a mask concealing. Treason. The burden of the crown, once a symbol of power and divine right, had become an unbearable weight, crushing him beneath its gilded splendor. He saw plots everywhere, imagined daggers glinting in the eyes of his courtiers, heard treachery in the sycophantic praises sung by his advisers. Sleep offered no respite, only a descent into feverish nightmares populated by grotesque figures, plotting his downfall. He was drowning in a sea of suspicion, and in his frantic, desperate struggle to survive, he grasped at the unthinkable. It began subtly, with dismissals and executions. Loyal servants, men who had served the crown faithfully for decades, were suddenly accused of heinous crimes, their heads rolling before dawn, their families cast into destitution. The court watched, paralyzed by fear, unsure who would be next to fall victim to the emperor's increasingly erratic judgments. But these were merely the prelude, the unsettling overture to a symphony of horror that would soon engulf the entire kingdom. The prophecy, that damned prophecy. It clung to him like a shroud, a constant, suffocating reminder of his supposed destiny. The seers had foretold it at his birth, that he would be the devourer of his own line, a monster who would feast upon his own flesh and blood. He had tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as the ramblings of superstitious fools, but the whispers persisted, growing louder with each passing day, fueling his mounting paranoia. What if it were true? What if he was destined to become the very monster he feared? The thought gnawed at him, a relentless, insatiable hunger that threatened to consume his sanity. He looked at his children, his beautiful, innocent children, and saw not the future of his dynasty, but the instruments of his destruction. They were a threat, a living embodiment of the prophecy, their very existence a challenge to his rule, a guarantee of his doom. It was an insane, twisted logic, born of fear and desperation. But in the emperor's fractured mind, it was the only truth that mattered. The first act was the hardest. The internal battle raged, a war between the man he once was and the monster he was becoming. He paced the halls of the palace, tormented by guilt and horror, the weight of his impending decision pressing down on him like a physical burden. He loved his children, he truly did, but the prophecy demanded sacrifice. Self-preservation demanded sacrifice. His survival, the survival of the kingdom, depended on it. Or so he convinced himself. The victim was his youngest son, a babe barely a year old, innocent, helpless, and utterly unaware of the monstrous fate that awaited him. The emperor, cloaked in darkness and driven by a perverted sense of duty, crept into the nursery in the dead of night. The guards, under strict orders to remain vigilant, yet equally terrified of questioning their ruler, stood motionless, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and grim understanding. The scene that followed was swift, brutal, and utterly devoid of humanity. There were no witnesses, no tearful farewells, no whispered prayers. Only the emperor, his son, and the chilling silence of the night. He rationalized it, of course, twisted the act into something noble, something necessary. He was saving the kingdom, preventing a future of chaos and destruction. He was sacrificing one life to save countless others. Lies, all lies, whispered to soothe his tormented conscience. But the truth remained, a dark stain that would never wash away. He had murdered his own child, a monstrous act of infanticide driven by fear and paranoia. The taste of ashes filled his mouth, the weight of guilt crushing him even more than the crown ever could. He had crossed a line, a point of no return, and there was no going back. This wasn't a crime of passion, a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated, premeditated act of self-preservation, born of madness and fueled by the insidious whispers of the prophecy, and it was just the beginning. The first taste of blood only whetted his appetite, deepening his descent into the abyss. He had tasted power, the power to defy fate, the power to control his own destiny, and he would not relinquish it, no matter the cost. The die was cast. The emperor who ate his own children had been born. A kingdom's nightmare was only beginning. The emperor's descent wasn't a slow, gradual slide into madness. It was a sickening, accelerating plunge, dragging the entire kingdom down with him. The whispers of treason hadn't just festered. They'd metastasized into a full-blown paranoia that consumed his every waking thought. He saw enemies in every shadow, conspiracies in every smile. And the children were the ultimate threat, a living, breathing challenge to his iron grip. The first act of desperation, that unthinkable horror, was initially shrouded in secrecy. But secrets, like poison, eventually seep through the cracks. The queen, ravaged by grief and unspeakable fear, could barely maintain a facade of normalcy. Her haunted eyes, her trembling hands, they screamed volumes louder than any spoken accusation. The court, a viper's nest of ambition and intrigue, noticed. They always noticed. The subtle shift in atmosphere was palpable, a suffocating blanket of dread woven from half-truths and terrified speculation. Imagine the court banquets. Once lavish affairs filled with music and laughter, they became silent, strained gatherings. Every clink of a goblet, every rustle of silk seemed amplified, echoing the unspoken terror in the air. Servants moved with hesitant steps, their eyes darting nervously, praying they wouldn't attract the emperor's attention. A wrong word, a misinterpreted glance, could be a death sentence. The emperor, sitting like a ghastly idol at the head of the table, surveyed his court with cold, calculating eyes. He saw potential assassins in every face, plotting his downfall, eager to usurp his throne, and the fear. Oh, the fear was intoxicating to him. It was a perverse validation of his power, a constant reminder that he and he alone held the keys to life and death. The executioner's axe became a familiar sight in the palace courtyard. Accusations, often based on the flimsiest of evidence or fueled by personal vendettas, were swiftly followed by swift and brutal justice. Noblemen, once powerful and influential, were dragged screaming to their deaths, their pleas for mercy drowned out by the emperor's chilling laughter. Their estates were seized, their families imprisoned, their names erased from the historical records. And with each execution, the fear intensified, solidifying the emperor's tyrannical rule. But it wasn't just the nobility who suffered. The emperor's paranoia extended to every corner of the realm. Farmers were accused of hoarding grain, merchants of price gouging, even children of disrespect. Informants, rewarded handsomely for their treachery, spread lies and rumors, turning neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. Trust evaporated, replaced by a pervasive sense of suspicion and betrayal. The once vibrant markets fell silent, the fields lay barren, and the kingdom teetered on the brink of famine. The emperor, cocooned in his palace of paranoia, remained oblivious to the suffering he inflicted. He saw only threats, enemies lurking in every shadow, plotting his demise. His meals were meticulously prepared by a team of loyal tasters, his chambers guarded by an army of heavily armed soldiers, his every move scrutinized by a network of spies. He was a prisoner of his own fear, trapped in a gilded cage of terror, and the executions ... they continued. More children disappeared. The official explanations became increasingly absurd, insulting the intelligence of even the most loyal subjects. Fallen ill and passed in the night, they would say. Or taken by a sudden fever. But the queen's grief was an open wound, a constant reminder of the horrific truth. The emperor, in his madness, seemed to believe that by eliminating his offspring, he was somehow cheating fate, defying the prophecy that haunted him. He saw it as a necessary sacrifice, a twisted act of self-preservation. But with each child he consumed, both literally and figuratively, he lost a piece of his humanity, descending further into the abyss of depravity. The kingdom, once a beacon of prosperity and culture, was now a wasteland of fear and despair. The light had gone out, replaced by an oppressive darkness that seemed to seep into the very bones of the people. Hope dwindled, replaced by a grim acceptance of their fate. They were living in a nightmare, ruled by a monster who wore the crown. And the worst part was, they didn't know how much longer they could endure it. Every sunrise brought a fresh wave of terror, every sunset a collective sigh of relief that they had survived another day. The emperor had not only destroyed his family, he had destroyed their world. Her world had fractured, shattered into a million jagged pieces, each one reflecting the grotesque reality of her husband's madness. Each one a shard of her stolen children. Oh, the children! The laughter, the tiny hands reaching for her, the innocent eyes that mirrored her own, all extinguished, snuffed out by the very man sworn to protect them. Grief, a monstrous tide, threatened to drown her whole. It clawed at her throat, choked her breath, and filled her vision with a red haze of anguish. But beneath the grief, a colder, sharper emotion began to crystallize. Horror. A visceral, paralyzing horror at the depths of depravity her husband, her king, had sunk to. How could he? How could he look into the faces of his own flesh and blood and see? Food? She remembered the first one. A sickly babe, yes, but still. Her babe. The emperor had claimed illness, a sudden swift decline. She had wept, inconsolable, clutching the lifeless form to her chest. But now Now the truth clawed its way from the shadows, a truth so monstrous it threatened to unravel her sanity. Then there were the others. Each death explained away with carefully constructed lies, each funeral a hollow performance of mourning. She had trusted him, she had loved him, she had believed him, and all the while he was consuming their children. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares stalked her, vivid and grotesque. She saw her children, their eyes wide with terror, their tiny bodies disappearing into the maw of a ravenous beast that wore her husband's face. She would wake screaming, drenched in sweat, the phantom weight of their absence crushing her chest. The court buzzed with whispers. Fear hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Everyone knew something was terribly wrong, but no one dared to speak openly. The emperor's paranoia had created a climate of terror, where even the slightest hint of dissent could be met with swift and brutal punishment. But she knew the truth. She lived the truth. And that truth was a burning coal in her heart, threatening to ignite a firestorm of rebellion. Yet she was the queen, the emperor's wife, bound to him by duty, by oaths, by the very fabric of their kingdom. To betray him was to betray everything she had ever known, everything she had ever believed in. It was to plunge the realm into chaos, to invite war and destruction. And what of her own life? If she spoke out, if she dared to accuse the emperor of such unspeakable crimes, she would be branded a traitor, a madwoman. Her life would be forfeit. But more than that, what would become of the remaining children? The ones who were still alive, still vulnerable to his monstrous hunger. That was the crux of her agonizing dilemma. To remain silent was to condemn her children, her kingdom, to a slow and horrifying death. But to speak out was to risk everything, to gamble with the lives of the very innocents she was trying to protect. She looked at the remaining children, playing innocently in the royal gardens, oblivious to the darkness that loomed over them. Their faces, so full of life and joy, were a constant reminder of what she had lost and what she stood to lose. Each day, the emperor grew more erratic, more paranoid. His eyes held a wild, unsettling glint. His touch, once a source of comfort, now sent shivers of revulsion down her spine. She could feel him watching her, studying her, trying to gauge her loyalty. He would speak of enemies, of conspiracies, of the need to protect the throne. He would look at her with those hollow eyes and ask, "Do you trust me, my queen?" And she would force herself to smile, to nod, to play the role of the dutiful wife, while inside her heart screamed in silent protest. The weight of her secret was crushing her. She felt like a prisoner in her own skin, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. She yearned to confide in someone, to share the burden of her knowledge, but who could she trust? The court was filled with spies and sycophants, eager to curry favor with the emperor. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, could seal her fate, and the fate of her children. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The queen existed in a state of perpetual torment, torn between her love for her children, her duty to her kingdom, and her horror at the man she had married. The decision loomed, inescapable, to betray or to endure, to speak or to remain silent, to risk everything for the sake of her children, or to condemn them to a fate worse than death. The answer, she knew, would determine not only her own destiny, but the destiny of her entire kingdom. And the clock was ticking. The emperor's madness was escalating, and the lives of her children hung precariously in the balance. The weight of the world pressed down on her, threatening to crush her beneath its unbearable burden. She was a queen, a mother, a prisoner of conscience. And the choice, the agonizing, impossible choice, was hers alone to make. The emperor's madness was a creeping vine, slowly strangling the life out of the kingdom. Every whispered conversation held the potential for a death sentence. Every smiling face hid a terrified heart. But within the palace walls, amidst the suffocating fear, A single spark of defiance flickered. It resided in the heart of Dr. Marius, the emperor's most trusted physician. Marius was no fool. He'd seen the subtle shifts in the emperor's demeanor, the unsettling glint in his eyes, the increasingly erratic orders. He'd initially dismissed them as the burdens of leadership, the pressures of a throne constantly under siege by enemies, both real and imagined. But then came the disappearances. The children, gone without a trace. Officially, they succumbed to illness, a sudden plague sweeping through the nursery. But Marius, with his intimate knowledge of the royal family's health, knew better. He saw the haunted look in the queen's eyes, the barely concealed grief etched on her face. He heard the hushed whispers among the servants, the rumors too terrible to speak aloud, and then one night he saw it himself. A glimpse, a fleeting, horrifying vision through a half-open door. Enough to confirm his worst nightmares. Enough to sear itself into his memory forever. The emperor, his face contorted in a grotesque parody of pleasure, consuming something unspeakable. From that moment on, Marius knew he couldn't stand idly by. He was a physician, sworn to protect life, not witness its systematic destruction. But how could he, a single man, hope to stand against the absolute power of a mad emperor? Open rebellion was suicide, not only for himself but for the innocent children he desperately wanted to protect. No, he needed a plan. A subtle, cunning plan that would exploit the emperor's paranoia and madness against him. He began to observe the emperor more closely, studying his routines, his obsessions, his delusions. He noted the growing distance between the emperor and the queen, the way the emperor now recoiled from her touch, seeing betrayal in her every glance. He saw the emperor's reliance on him, Marius, as the only man he could truly trust. This, Marius realized, was his key. He started subtly planting seeds of doubt in the emperor's mind, reinforcing his existing paranoia. "Your Majesty," he would say during their consultations, "I worry about the loyalty of the guards. I've overheard whispers, discontent, among the ranks, or the chefs, Your Majesty. They seem overly familiar with the royal children. Are you certain of their allegiances?" With each carefully chosen word, Marius tightened the noose of suspicion around the emperor's mind. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but the lives of the remaining children hung in the balance. He began to subtly alter the emperor's meals, adding herbs known to induce vivid dreams and paranoia. He wanted to amplify the emperor's madness, to push him further down the rabbit hole of his own delusions, while manipulating the emperor's state of mind. Marius was also working on a far more dangerous scheme. He confided in a handful of trusted servants, individuals who had served the royal family for years, and whose loyalty was beyond question. He told them, in hushed tones and with trembling hands, the truth about the emperor's actions. Initially, they were incredulous, horrified. But when Marius presented them with irrefutable evidence, a discarded bone, a blood-stained garment, they could no longer deny the terrible reality. Together, they hatched a plan to spirit the remaining children out of the palace and into hiding. The queen, broken and terrified, was brought into the fold. Despite her immense grief and fear for her own life, she agreed to help. It was, she knew, the only way to save her remaining children from becoming the emperor's next meal. Marius, drawing upon his medical knowledge, concocted a sleeping potion that would render the children unconscious for several hours. Under the cover of darkness, the loyal servants would then replace the children with animals, piglets, swaddled in royal garments, and smuggle the real children out of the palace through a secret passage known only to a select few. The plan was fraught with peril. One wrong step, one careless word, and their plot would be exposed, leading to certain death for everyone involved. But Marius and his co-conspirators were driven by a fierce determination to protect the innocent, to defy the madness that had gripped their emperor and their kingdom. The night of the substitution arrived, heavy with tension and fear. Marius administered the sleeping potion to the children, his hands shaking as he held each small, innocent body. He knew that this was his last chance. If the plan failed, all would be lost. As the children drifted into a deep slumber, the servants moved with practiced efficiency, replacing them with the piglets. The queen, her heart breaking anew with each substitution, watched in silent agony, her tears mingling with the shadows of the night. The piglets, unaware of their role in this deadly charade, snuffled and grunted in their makeshift cradles. Marius held his breath, listening for any sign that their deception had been discovered. The palace remained silent, save for the distant sounds of the guards patrolling the corridors. The switch was complete. Now came the most dangerous part: smuggling the children out of the palace, wrapped in blankets and disguised as commoners. The children were carried through this secret passage, a labyrinth of tunnels and hidden chambers that snaked beneath the palace. Marius led the way, his heart pounding in his chest with every step. They moved slowly, cautiously, avoiding the gaze of any guards they encountered. Finally, they reached the outside world, emerging into the cool night air. Awaiting them was a carriage, ready to whisk the children away to a safe haven, far from the clutches of their mad father. As the carriage disappeared into the darkness, Marius felt a surge of relief, mixed with a profound sense of sorrow. He had saved the children, but he knew that his own life was now forfeit. He had defied the emperor, and the emperor would not forgive such treachery. But as he turned back towards the palace, Marius knew that he had done the right thing. He had chosen humanity over tyranny, compassion over madness. And that, he thought, was a victory worth dying for. His plot was only beginning. The emperor, a man drowning in the murky depths of his own madness, saw threats where there were none. Every innocent smile, every whispered conversation, every shadow cast upon the palace walls became evidence of conspiracies against him, plots to steal his throne, his life, his very being. And the most terrifying threat of all, in his twisted mind, came from his own children. Each new royal birth was a fresh wave of paranoia crashing against the ramparts of his sanity, a stark reminder of his own mortality and the potential for his downfall. But there was one man in the court who saw the emperor's descent not with fear, but with a burning sense of responsibility. The royal physician, a man of science and compassion, had witnessed the emperor's actions with growing horror. He saw the light fading from the queen's eyes, the fear etched on the faces of the courtiers, the creeping despair that threatened to consume the entire kingdom. He understood that reason was lost on the emperor, that logic was powerless against the tide of his madness. So he resolved to act, to gamble everything on a desperate, audacious plan. The physician knew he couldn't confront the emperor directly. Any challenge, any hint of dissent, would be met with swift and brutal retribution. He had to be subtle, to work in the shadows, to manipulate the emperor's paranoia for the good of the kingdom, and above all, to save the remaining royal children from a horrifying fate. His plan was audacious, bordering on insane: to replace the royal children with animals. It was a gamble that could cost him his life, the queen her sanity, and the children their future. But it was the only chance they had. He knew the risks, the impossible nature of the task, but the alternative, the continued slaughter of innocents, was simply unthinkable. The first hurdle was gaining the queen's trust. She was a woman consumed by grief, trapped in a nightmare of her own making, forced to share a bed with a monster. Approaching her with such a scheme was fraught with danger. What if she, in her despair, betrayed him to the emperor? What if the very act of offering her hope only plunged her deeper into despair? He chose his moment carefully. A stolen conversation in the royal gardens, a brief exchange of whispered words amidst the carefully cultivated roses, each bloom a silent witness to the unfolding tragedy. He spoke of the prophecy not as a prediction of inevitable doom, but as a challenge, a curse that could be broken. He spoke of the children not as threats to the emperor's reign, but as innocent souls deserving of life, of love, of a future. And he spoke of his plan, laying bare its inherent risks, its audacious improbability, but also its desperate necessity. The queen listened, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. At first she recoiled in horror, dismissing the physician's plan as madness, a descent into the very insanity that plagued her husband. But as he spoke, as he painted a picture of hope amidst the darkness, a flicker of defiance ignited within her. The thought of her children, safe and hidden, living in secret, was a beacon in the overwhelming darkness. The alternative, their inevitable demise at the hands of their father, was simply unbearable. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, she agreed. The next step was the most delicate, acquiring the animals. He couldn't simply steal them from the royal menagerie. The disappearance of a prized animal would raise suspicions, alerting the emperor and his ever-watchful spies. He needed animals that resembled the royal children, at least in size and weight, creatures that could convincingly be presented as slumbering infants during the emperor's infrequent, paranoid inspections. He turned to the city's underbelly, to the animal traders and back-alley merchants who dealt in the exotic and the forbidden. He spoke in hushed tones, using coded language, hinting at a need for rare breeds and unusual specimens. He offered exorbitant sums of money, enough to tempt even the most cautious of criminals. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to assemble his bizarre menagerie, a litter of newborn piglets, their plump bodies swaddled in royal blankets. A pair of fluffy white rabbits, their eyes gleaming in the dim light of the physician's chambers. A young monkey, its playful antics a stark contrast to the grim reality of its role. With the animal secured, the physician turned his attention to the logistics of the switch. He needed accomplices, loyal servants who could be trusted with this deadly secret. He chose wisely, selecting individuals who had witnessed the emperor's cruelty firsthand, those who had suffered under his reign and yearned for a return to peace and sanity. Under the cover of darkness, they practiced the substitution, rehearsing the movements, perfecting the timing, ensuring that every detail was flawless. The physician drilled them relentlessly, emphasizing the importance of silence, of discretion, of absolute obedience. One mistake, one slip-up, could doom them all. The day of the first substitution arrived, a day thick with tension and unspoken fear. The emperor, gripped by one of his increasingly frequent fits of paranoia, had demanded to see his youngest child, to confirm its loyalty. The queen, her face a mask of composure, stalled for time, feigning illness, pleading with the emperor to postpone the inspection. Meanwhile, the physician and his accomplices worked feverishly, preparing the piglet for its debut. They swaddled it in the royal blankets, carefully positioning it in the cradle, hoping against hope that the emperor wouldn't notice the difference. When the emperor finally arrived, his eyes were wild, his movements erratic. He approached the cradle cautiously, as if expecting the infant to attack him. He peered down at the sleeping piglet, his gaze intense, searching for any sign of treachery. For a moment, the entire palace held its breath. Then, with a grunt, the emperor turned away, muttering something about enemies within. The substitution had worked, but the physician knew this was only the beginning. He had bought them time, a precious commodity in a kingdom ruled by madness. Time to sway the emperor's mind, to break through the layers of paranoia that shrouded his sanity, to remind him of the man he once was, the man he could still be. He began subtly influencing the emperor, planting seeds of doubt in his mind, questioning the motives of his advisors, suggesting alternative interpretations of the prophecies. He appealed to the emperor's vanity, reminding him of his past glories, his wise decisions, his unwavering strength. He used flattery, manipulation, and subtle suggestion to chip away at the emperor's paranoia, hoping to weaken its grip on his mind. It was a long and arduous process, a delicate dance between hope and despair, but the physician refused to give up. He knew that the fate of the kingdom, the lives of the queen and her children, rested on his shoulders. He would continue to fight, to scheme, to gamble everything, until the emperor was either restored to sanity or deposed from his throne. The survival of the royal children, and perhaps the entire kingdom, depended on it. And so, the emperor began his descent into a fortress of his own making, brick by paranoid brick. He severed ties one by one from those who had once advised him, those who had guided him, those who had perhaps dared to question him. His council chambers, once bustling with lively debate and strategic planning, fell silent. The quills ceased to scratch across parchment, the maps gathered dust. The voices that once offered wisdom were now met with suspicion, accusations of treachery lurking beneath every well-intentioned word. You see, the first taste of blood, the first desperate act of self-preservation, it wasn't a singular event. It was the opening of a floodgate, unleashing a torrent of fear and paranoia that swept away all reason and replaced it with a chilling, unwavering conviction. Everyone was a threat. Every smile hid a dagger, every gesture concealed a plot. Every whispered conversation was a conspiracy against him, the divinely ordained ruler that his once trusted advisors, men who had dedicated their lives to the stability and prosperity of the realm, were now viewed as snakes in the grass, their loyalty as nothing more than a carefully crafted facade. He imagined them huddled in darkened corners, their faces illuminated by flickering candlelight, plotting his downfall, whispering promises of power to ambitious rivals. He saw betrayal in their eyes, even when they offered only deference and concern. The generals, the backbone of his military might, were no different. He envisioned them leading his armies not to victory, but to ruin, deliberately weakening his defenses, leaving him vulnerable to the encroaching enemies that he now saw on every border, real or imagined. He suspected them of secretly training rebel factions, arming dissidents, waiting for the opportune moment to strike and seize the throne for themselves. Even his own family, the blood that ran through his veins, became objects of profound distrust. His brothers, his cousins, his uncles, each one a potential usurper, each one harboring a secret desire for the crown. He saw ambition burning in their eyes, a hunger for power that mirrored his own, only now he viewed that hunger as a deadly threat. He imagined them gathering in secret, their voices hushed, plotting his assassination, promising each other the spoils of his kingdom. The court physicians, once entrusted with his health and well-being, were now viewed as potential poisoners, their remedies suspected of being laced with deadly toxins, designed to slowly weaken him, to rob him of his strength and his sanity. He tasted every morsel of food with extreme caution, his mind racing with the possibility that it was his last meal, that the very next bite would be his undoing. The emperor became a prisoner in his own palace, surrounded by guards he didn't trust, served by servants he suspected of treachery, haunted by the ghosts of his paranoia. He barricaded himself within the royal chambers, his only companions the ever-present fear and the gnawing guilt that he desperately tried to suppress. Once vibrant and bustling palace, the heart of the kingdom became a tomb of silence and suspicion. The laughter of courtiers, the music of minstrels, the lively discussions of state affairs, all were replaced by an eerie stillness, a palpable sense of dread that permeated every corner of the royal residence. The courtiers, sensing the emperor's growing madness, began to whisper among themselves, their voices hushed with fear and uncertainty. They avoided his gaze, terrified of becoming the next target of his paranoia. The kingdom suffered. Decisions of state were delayed, then forgotten. Infrastructure crumbled, trade withered. The people, sensing the instability at the top, grew restless, their discontent simmering beneath the surface. Whispers of rebellion, once confined to the shadows, began to grow louder, fueled by the emperor's increasingly erratic behavior and the pervasive sense of fear that gripped the land. But there was one exception, a single thread of connection that remained unbroken amidst the emperor's self-imposed isolation: his queen. She alone was allowed into his presence. She alone was still trusted. Perhaps it was her unwavering devotion, her gentle nature, her unwavering belief in his inherent goodness that shielded her from his suspicion. Or perhaps it was something more sinister, a calculated manipulation on her part, a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control amidst the chaos that was consuming the kingdom. Whatever the reason, the queen remained his confidant, his advisor, his only link to the outside world. She soothed his anxieties, calmed his fears, and attempted to reason with him, to steer him away from the abyss of madness that threatened to engulf him. She was the only one who dared to speak the truth to him, to challenge his delusions, to remind him of the man he once was, the just and benevolent ruler he had aspired to be. But even her influence was waning. The emperor, consumed by his paranoia, began to question her motives as well. He wondered if she too was secretly plotting against him, if her devotion was nothing more than a carefully constructed act, designed to lull him into a false sense of security. He saw suspicion flicker in his eyes, a shadow of doubt that threatened to eclipse the love and trust that had once bound them together. And so, the emperor, alone in his fortress of fear, teetered on the brink of madness, his kingdom crumbling. Around him, his only solace the presence of his queen, a presence that even he, in his darkest moments, suspected might be his ultimate undoing. He was trapped, a prisoner of his own making, with no escape from the horrors that plagued his mind, and no one left to trust but the woman he feared the most. The isolation was complete. The emperor, weakened and haunted, found himself teetering on the very precipice of madness. The line between reality and nightmare began to dissolve, like a sandcastle consumed by the relentless tide of his own guilt. Sleep offered no respite, only a descent into the most grotesque corners of his tormented mind. Imagine, if you will, the sheer horror of his nights. Visions, so vivid they felt real, assaulted him from all sides. The faces of his slain children, contorted in silent screams, flickered in the darkness. Their tiny hands, reaching out with accusations, clawed at his conscience. He'd bolt upright in bed, drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom scent of blood clinging to his nostrils. The silence of the royal chambers, once a symbol of his power, now echoed with the ghostly whispers of their innocence. But these were not mere nightmares. They were waking visions too. Walking through the palace, he would swear he saw them playing. In the gardens, their laughter turning into mocking cries as he approached. He'd reach out to touch them, only to find his hand grasping at empty air. The tapestries on the walls seemed to writhe and twist, depicting scenes of grotesque feasts where he was the main course. The ornate furniture transformed into monstrous shapes, their shadows dancing with malicious intent. The very air around him crackled with a malevolent energy. The emperor would often find himself conversing with people who weren't there, arguing with phantoms only he could see. He'd rant and rave at his advisors, accusing them of treachery based on the paranoid fantasies that plagued his mind. His pronouncements became increasingly erratic, his judgment clouded by the fog of his delusion. He tried desperately to maintain a semblance of control, but his grasp on reality was slipping away with each passing day. His once sharp intellect became a weapon turned against himself. He dissected every word, every action, searching for hidden meanings and treacherous plots that existed only in his imagination. A simple cough from a servant became a sign of impending rebellion. A concerned glance from a courtier became evidence of a conspiracy. The world, once his to command, now appeared as a treacherous labyrinth of deceit and betrayal. And the voices, oh, the voices! They swirled around him, a cacophony of condemnation and despair. The voices of his ancestors warning of the curse that had befallen him. The voices of his enemies gloating at his impending doom. And most horrifying of all, the voices of his children pleading for mercy that he had so brutally denied. He would clutch his head, trying to silence the infernal chorus, but they only grew louder, more insistent, driving him further into the abyss of his madness. Food turned to ash in his mouth. Drink offered no solace. He became a prisoner in his own body, trapped in a waking nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. He trusted no one, suspecting even his own reflection. His queen, once his confidant and solace, now became another source of suspicion. He saw betrayal in her eyes, even as she desperately tried to comfort him. Her gentle touch felt like a viper's embrace, her words of reassurance like subtle taunts. He began to neglect his appearance, his regal garments replaced by disheveled robes. He refused to bathe, the grime and sweat becoming a physical manifestation of his inner decay. His once majestic palace became a reflection of his crumbling mind, the opulent halls filled with cobwebs and shadows. The gardens, once meticulously manicured, became overgrown and wild, mirroring the chaos that reigned within his soul. His sanity was a fragile thread, stretched to its breaking point. He knew, deep down, that he was losing himself. He felt his mind shattering into a million pieces, each one carrying a fragment of his shattered conscience. He longed for peace, for silence, for an end to the torment, but there was no escape from the demons he had created. The Emperor's madness was not a sudden descent, but a slow, agonizing erosion of his humanity. Each act of violence, each moment of paranoia, chipped away at his soul until only a hollow shell remained. He became a monster, not by birth, but by choice. And as he spiraled further into the depths of his insanity, he dragged his entire kingdom down with him. The consequences of his actions were about to unleash a storm of fury that would sweep away everything he held dear. He was about to learn that even an emperor cannot escape the judgment of his own people, and that some sins can never be forgiven. His time was running out, and the reckoning was at hand. Prepare yourselves, because what comes next will paint a grim picture of justice. A land that will no longer turn the other cheek. The people will not stand for it any longer. They want answers, and their sorrow will be answered. The whispers, the hushed tones, they couldn't be contained. The Emperor's unspeakable acts, his grotesque feasts born of madness and fear, began to seep like poison into the very soil of the kingdom. At first, it was mere rumor, a shadow flitting at the edge of consciousness. Did you hear? They say, the children. The royal children. But the rumors, like a persistent plague, refused to be silenced. Servants, their eyes wide with terror, muttered in the marketplace. Guards, hardened by years of service, exchanged uneasy glances in the palace corridors. Farmers, tilling the fields under the watchful gaze of the sun, spoke in fearful riddles, understanding dawning in their weathered faces. And then the truth exploded. The Queen's physician, a man of unwavering conscience, finally broke his silence. He'd witnessed the horror firsthand, the butchery disguised as royal decree. He carried the unbearable weight of his knowledge, the agonizing choice he'd made to protect the remaining children. He couldn't stand it any longer. He couldn't bear to see his people, his kingdom, consumed by this creeping darkness. So he fled the palace under the cover of night, carrying with him not gold or jewels, but the devastating truth. He went to the people, the common folk, the downtrodden and the forgotten. He spoke not of politics or power, but of unimaginable cruelty, of a king who had become a monster. He told them of the empty cradles, the silent nurseries, the blood-stains scrubbed raw from the palace floors. He told them of the Queen silent, weeping, her soul shattered by the unspeakable loss. And he told them of the Emperor's paranoia, his descent into madness, his twisted justification for the slaughter of innocents. He spoke with raw emotion, with a desperation that mirrored their own growing dread. He showed them the marks on his own body from where he had been tortured for this information. His words were like a spark in dry tinder. Decades of suffering, of oppressive taxes, of dismissive indifference from the court. All of it ignited in a furious blaze. The people, already teetering on the brink of despair, finally snapped. The emperor, in his twisted pursuit of self-preservation, had signed his own death warrant. He had forgotten that a kingdom is not built on fear, but on trust, on justice, on the fundamental bond between ruler and ruled. He had broken that bond. Beyond repair, outrage, raw and visceral, swept through the land like a wildfire. The farmers, their hands calloused from years of toil, traded their plows for pitchforks and axes. The merchants, their livelihoods threatened by the emperor's erratic decrees, closed their shops and sharpened their swords. The soldiers, many of whom had families of their own, deserted their posts, their loyalty to the throne shattered by the emperor's depravity. Desperation fueled their anger. They saw their own children in the faces of the slain princes and princesses. They imagined the terror in their eyes, the pleas for mercy that went unanswered. They felt the queen's anguish as their own, the unbearable weight of loss and betrayal. This wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about survival. It was about protecting their families, their communities, their very souls from the emperor's insatiable hunger. Small bands of rebels began to form, coalescing around charismatic leaders who emerged from the shadows. These were not seasoned generals or nobles seeking power. They were ordinary people, driven to extraordinary acts by the sheer weight of their desperation. There was Anya, a farmer's widow who had lost her husband to the emperor's conscription. Her eyes burned with a righteous fury, and her voice, though soft, carried the weight of 1,000 sorrows. There was Theron, a blacksmith whose forge had been commandeered by the palace to make weapons for the emperor's personal guard. He wielded his hammer not to shape metal, but to crush the skulls of the tyrant's loyalists. And there was Alara, a scholar who had once served in the royal library, now using her knowledge not to preserve history, but to rewrite it in the blood of the oppressors. These leaders, and countless others like them, tapped into the collective rage of the people, channeling it into a powerful force. They organized training exercises in secret, turning ordinary citizens into a formidable fighting force. They stockpiled weapons and supplies, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the emperor's forces. The rebellion spread like a contagion, infecting every village, every town, every corner of the kingdom. The emperor, holed up in his palace, remained oblivious, his paranoia blinding him to the gathering storm outside his gilded cage. He saw only enemies within his court, failing to recognize the true threat brewing among the common folk. The whispers turned to shouts, the shadows to a raging fire. The people were no longer afraid. They were empowered, united by their shared outrage and their desperate hope for a better future. They marched towards the capital, a vast, unstoppable wave of humanity, their hearts filled with a burning desire for justice. The emperor, in his madness, had sown the seeds of his own destruction, and now the harvest was at hand. The people were coming, and they were coming for blood. The cries of the rebellion echoed through the lands. It was now or never. This was the time to take back what had been lost. Begins Section 12, The Fall of a Tyrant. The whispers turned to shouts. The fear, festering in the hearts of the people, finally erupted. Years of dread, years of unanswered prayers for the slain, years of living under the shadow of a madman. It all coalesced into a storm of righteous fury. The emperor, the monster who devoured his own children, had pushed his kingdom too far. From every corner of the land they came. Farmers traded plows for pitchforks, blacksmiths hammered swords instead of horseshoes, and even the most loyal soldiers, their consciences finally awakened, deserted the emperor's banner. It wasn't just a rebellion anymore. It was an avalanche. of vengeance, a tidal wave of pent-up rage surging towards the gilded cage where the emperor had barricaded himself. The palace, once a symbol of opulence and power, now resembled a fortress under siege. Its golden gates, normally flung open to welcome supplicants, were slammed shut, reinforced with iron and guarded by the few remaining loyalists, men driven more by fear of the emperor's wrath than by any genuine allegiance. They were pawns in a game already lost, clinging desperately to the sinking ship of a tyrant's reign. The rebel army, a motley crew of ordinary citizens united by extraordinary desperation, surrounded the palace walls. They lacked the discipline and training of professional soldiers, but they possessed something far more potent, an unshakable conviction in the justice of their cause. They were fighting for their families, for their freedom, for the very soul of their kingdom, and they would not be denied. The first assault was a chaotic, bloody mess. The rebels, armed with makeshift weapons and fueled by adrenaline, charged the palace gates, only to be met by a hail of arrows and a wall of steel. Many fell, their bodies littering the ground before the formidable fortifications, but their sacrifice was not in vain. Their sheer numbers and unwavering determination began to wear down the defenders. Inside the palace, panic reigned supreme. The emperor, holed up in his throne room, was a shadow of his former self. The paranoia that had driven him to such unspeakable acts now gnawed at him with ravenous hunger. He paced back and forth, muttering to himself, his eyes wide with terror. The walls, once adorned with portraits of his ancestors, now seemed to close in on him, mocking his delusions of grandeur. He barked orders at his remaining advisors, demanding reinforcements, demanding a swift and decisive victory. But his words were met with hollow silence. The advisors, sensing the inevitable, had already begun to contemplate their own survival. They knew that the emperor's reign was over, and they were desperately trying to distance themselves from his impending doom. The queen, however, remained by his side. Despite the unspeakable horrors she had witnessed, despite the profound grief that threatened to consume her, she refused to abandon him. Perhaps it was a sense of duty, perhaps a flicker of the love she once felt for him, or perhaps simply the fear of what would become of her if he fell. Whatever the reason, she was his only companion in his final hours of power. As the fighting raged outside, the physician, the one who had dared to defy the emperor and save the remaining children, worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He had secretly contacted some of the palace guards, men he knew to be honorable and disgusted by the emperor's actions. He convinced them to open a secret passage, a hidden escape route that would allow the rebel forces to breach the palace defenses from within. Plan worked. Under the cover of darkness, a small group of rebels slipped through the secret passage and infiltrated the palace. They moved swiftly and silently, taking out the guards one by one until they reached the main courtyard. With a signal flare, they announced their presence, throwing the remaining loyalists into disarray. The rebel forces, emboldened by this unexpected advantage, renewed their assault on the palace gates with even greater ferocity. The defenders, caught between the external onslaught and the internal rebellion, finally crumbled. The gates were breached, and the rebel army poured into the palace, their cries of vengeance echoing through the once sacred halls. The battle for the palace was a brutal, chaotic melee. Loyalists fought desperately to protect their emperor, while rebels fought with the fury of a people betrayed. The opulent rooms, once filled with music and laughter, were now stained with blood and littered with corpses. The air was thick with the stench of death and the screams of the dying. The emperor, hearing the sounds of battle drawing closer, finally snapped. He grabbed a sword from the wall and rushed out of the throne room, determined to face his enemies head-on. But he was no warrior. Years of decadence and paranoia had weakened him, both physically and mentally. He stumbled through the palace corridors, a pathetic figure in his royal robes, A far cry from the powerful ruler he once was. He encountered a group of rebels, their faces grim and determined. They recognized him instantly, and a hush fell over the group. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a collective roar, they charged. The emperor fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, but he was no match for the rebels. He swung his sword wildly, but his movements were clumsy and predictable. He was quickly overwhelmed, disarmed, and dragged to the ground. The queen, witnessing the emperor's capture, let out a piercing scream. She rushed towards him, trying to protect him from the mob. But she was too late. The rebels, fueled by years of pent-up rage, descended upon the emperor, their fists and weapons raining down on him. The emperor, the monster who had devoured his own children, was finally brought to his knees. His reign of terror was over. The palace, once a symbol of his power, was now his prison. And the people, the ones he had terrorized and oppressed, were now his judges. The fall of the tyrant was complete, paving the way for a reckoning as dark as the deeds that preceded it. The revolt had been swift, merciless, and utterly complete. The gilded cage of the palace, once a symbol of absolute power, had become his prison. Now stripped bare, both physically and metaphorically, the emperor faced the music. But this wasn't just execution. Oh no, that would have been far too merciful. The people, and more importantly, the new council representing them, wanted something symbolic. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted to inflict a fate so horrendous, so viscerally impactful, that it would serve as an eternal warning against the abuse of power. And they delivered first, the symbolic stripping. His royal robes, each thread woven with gold and representing the authority he so brutally wielded, were torn from his body one by one. Not neatly, not respectfully, but ripped with a savage glee that echoed the pain he had inflicted on countless others. Every tear was a whispered curse, a memory of injustice, a child's cry silenced too soon. The crown, that heavy circlet of metal and jewels, was not gently removed. It was wrenched from his head, tearing at his scalp, a fitting parallel to the way he had torn apart the very fabric of the kingdom. Then came the procession. A slow, agonizing march through the streets he once commanded. No longer riding in a lavish carriage, showered with adoration, he was dragged through the mud and filth, a spectacle of broken majesty. The crowds lined the streets, not with cheers, but with jeers, spittle, and stones. Each hurled object, each shouted insult, was a testament to his failure, a physical manifestation of the hatred he had sown. He who once demanded absolute obedience now begged for mercy, his voice hoarse and cracked, lost in the cacophony of contempt. But the real horror was yet to come. The council, in their twisted wisdom, had decided on a punishment that mirrored the emperor's crimes. He had devoured his own children, figuratively and literally, through his insatiable lust for power. He had consumed the lifeblood of the kingdom to sustain his own bloated ego. Therefore, his punishment would involve starvation. But not a quick, clean death from lack of sustenance. That wouldn't do. They constructed a cage. A massive, ornate structure of iron and wood, designed not to imprison the body, but to torment the mind. It was placed in the center of the city square, a constant reminder to the people of their hard-won freedom. Inside, the emperor was placed naked and exposed to the elements. He was given water, enough to prolong his suffering, but no food. Around the cage, the council erected displays. Grotesque still lifes of abundance, overflowing with the very foods he craved. Roasted meats, plump fruits, golden loaves of bread, all within sight, but utterly beyond reach. The aroma, thick and tantalizing, filled the air, a constant torment to his gnawing hunger. It was a cruel mockery, a constant reminder of the feasts he had enjoyed while his people starved. But it didn't end there. Oh no, the council was just getting started. Each day, they paraded before the caged children, Healthy, well-fed children, laughing and playing, their innocence a stark contrast to the emperor's depravity. They offered these children the finest sweets and treats right in front of him, the sugary scent a further assault on his senses. They were living proof of the life he had stolen, the future he had destroyed. And then came the mothers, the women whose children he had slaughtered, either directly or indirectly through his neglect. They came to the cage, not to seek revenge, but to offer forgiveness, a forgiveness he did not deserve. They held up portraits of their lost children, their eyes filled with sorrow, their voices filled with a quiet strength that shamed him to his core. They spoke of the dreams they had for their children, the potential that had been extinguished, the void that would never be filled. Each word was a knife, twisting in his soul. As the days turned into weeks, the emperor's body began to betray him. His skin stretched taut over his bones, his eyes sunken and hollow. His once powerful frame withered, reduced to a skeletal husk. His mind, too, began to unravel. He hallucinated, seeing the faces of his dead children mocking him, their skeletal fingers pointing accusingly. He screamed, he wept, he begged for death, but no one answered his pleas. The people watched, not with satisfaction, but with a grim understanding. They saw the slow, agonizing death of a tyrant, a visible representation of the consequences of unchecked power. They saw the price of cruelty, the ultimate cost of betrayal. Even in his madness, the emperor understood the symbolism of his punishment. He was being consumed, not by food, but by his own guilt, his own regrets, his own monstrous deeds. He was being forced to confront the horror he had inflicted, to experience, in a small way, the suffering he had caused. His death, when it finally came, was not a release, but a culmination. A final desperate gasp for air, a last pathetic whimper. His body, a grotesque parody of its former self, lay slumped in the cage, a testament to the destructive power of ambition and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The cage remained in the city square for months after his death, a chilling reminder of the past. Eventually, it was dismantled, but the memory of the emperor and his gruesome fate lingered in the collective consciousness, a dark chapter in the kingdom's history, a lesson etched in blood and bone, a lesson that would never be forgotten. For in the end, the emperor was not just punished for his crimes, he was immortalized as a symbol of tyranny, a cautionary tale for all those who dared to abuse their power. He was given a fate far worse than death, to be remembered forever, as the emperor who devoured his own children. And now you too will carry this story with you. Pleasant dreams.